Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if newborn Deku was born with Gojo Satoru's 6 eyes, Limitless and Mahoraga's abilities. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. The television in the Midoriya living room was too loud, the way it always was when All Might was on screen, and 4-year-old Izuku sat close enough to it that his mother kept telling him he'd ruin his eyes. He didn't ruin his eyes. Not that day anyway. That would come later, and in a way his mother could never have imagined. On screen, a building in Mizurufu was on fire, an old apartment complex, the kind with 2 narrow stairwells and windows that didn't open all the way, the kind that turned into a coffin in about 4 minutes if nobody came. Firefighters were shouting. Smoke was rolling black and thick into a colorless sky, and then there was a shape at the top of the frame, a streak of gold and blue, and the shape became a man, and the man became All Might, and it was over before Izuku had time to be scared for the people trapped inside. Have no fear! All Might's voice boomed out of the tinny television speakers, distorted with volume and static, and still somehow the most reassuring sound Izuku had ever heard. Why, you ask? Because I am here. He came out of the smoke carrying 3 people at once, 1 under each arm and a 3rd slung over his shoulder like a sack of rice, and he was laughing. Not a mean laugh. A laugh like the whole thing had been fun, like saving lives was the best part of his day, and he couldn't wait for the next emergency so he could do it again. Izuku's hands were pressed so hard against his cheeks that his fingers ached, and he didn't notice he was crying until his mother crouched down next to him with a tissue. Izuku-in, Inko said, dabbing at his face, you're gonna wear a hole in the carpet if you sit that close every day. He's so cool, Izuku said, which was not a response to anything she'd said, but was the only sentence available to him at the time. Mom, did you see? He caught all 3 of them and he didn't even look tired, and the building was still on fire and Mom, I want to do that. I want to save people like that. Inko smiled the soft, indulgent smile of a mother whose son had said something like this roughly 400 times that month, and ruffled his hair, and said, I know, sweetheart, in the tone of someone who assumed there was plenty of time to figure out how. There is a version of this story, the one everyone else got to live, where Izuku Midoriya grows up quirkless in a world built for people with power, and his story is a story about what a person can do with nothing but scribbled notebooks and a stubborn heart, and the willingness to break his own body a little more each time until someone finally gives him something to work with. This is not that story. Not entirely. Because 6 years later, in a doctor's office that smelled like antiseptic and the particular anxious sweat of a parent who already knew what she was about to hear, something in Izuku Midoriya was already beginning to open. It just hadn't opened all the way yet, and nobody, not the doctor examining the extra joint in his little toe with a frown that had already made up its mind, not his mother wringing her hands in the plastic chair beside him, not Izuku himself, staring down at his own feet like they betrayed him. Nobody in that room had the faintest idea what they were actually looking at. The doctor's name was Tsubasa. He had kind eyes and cold hands and a way of talking to children like they were slightly deaf adults, over-enunciating every word. Now, Izuku, he said, holding up an X-ray of a small foot with 1 too many joints in the smallest toe. Do you know what this means? Izuku, 10 years old and dressed in the paper gown that always made him feel like a piece of hospital furniture, shook his head even though he already knew. He'd known for 2 years, if he was honest with himself. He'd known since the day Bakugo's palms had started popping and crackling like tiny firecrackers on the playground. Since Katsuki had held up his hands and grinned that new, sharp grin and said, look what I can do, Deku, look what I can do, and Izuku's hands had stayed exactly, boringly the same. It means my toe bone is weird, Izuku said. It means, Dr. Tsubasa said gently, that you have what we call a quirkless marker. Only 1 joint, instead of 2. About 20% of the population is born this way now. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it does mean you won't develop a quirk. Won't. Not might not. Not we'll have to wait and see. Won't, with the flat, clinical finality of a door being locked from the outside. Izuku had rehearsed being brave for this moment. He'd practiced it in the mirror that morning, the way he was going to nod seriously and say okay like a grown-up, like best genius accepting a difficult mission. What actually happened was that his eyes went hot and blurry almost instantly, and he had to look very hard at the little poster of the muscular system on the far wall to keep from making a sound. Beside him, his mother made the sound instead. A small, broken O, not for herself, but for him, and that was somehow worse, hearing his mother's heart crack a little on his behalf. He can still lead a full life, Dr. Tsubasa continued, in the tone of someone reading off a card he'd read off 1,000 times before. 80% of quirkless individuals report high overall life satisfaction. There are wonderful, meaningful careers that don't require. I want to be a hero, Izuku said. It came out smaller than he meant it to. Dr. Tsubasa's kind eyes went kinder in the specific way that adults' eyes went kind right before they said something Izuku did not want to hear. I know a lot of boys your age say that, he said. But heroism, real heroism, the kind on the news, that's an incredibly physically demanding profession. Without a quirk, I'm afraid it's just not realistic. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm sorry. Izuku would hear that phrase so many more times over the following years, from teachers, from other kids' parents, eventually, unbearably, from Katsuki himself in a different context entirely, that it would start to lose its edges, the way any word does when you touch it too many times. But this first time, sitting on cold examination paper in a gown that didn't close properly in the back, it cut clean through him. He did not cry in the office. He held it, the way he'd learned to hold his breath underwater in swimming lessons, past the point where it hurt, past the point where his mother was squeezing his hand so hard it should have hurt more than it did. He cried in the elevator instead, once the doors closed and it was just the two of them and the tinny elevator music and his own reflection warped in the brushed steel doors. His mother knelt down right there, ignoring the elevator's slow descent, and pulled him into her, and said the words that Izuku would turn over and over in his head for years afterward, sometimes with love, sometimes, much later, with a complicated ache he never quite resolved. I'm sorry, Inko said into his hair. I'm so sorry, Izuku. He didn't understand, at 10, why she was apologizing. It wasn't her fault. It would take him a long time to understand that she wasn't apologizing for the diagnosis. She was apologizing for the years of maybe she'd let him believe in. The birthday candles blown out with a wish that was always the same wish. The time she'd let him talk about which hero costume he wanted without gently steering him towards something safer to want. She was apologizing for hope, is what she was doing. And Izuku, small and shaking against her shoulder in a hospital elevator, thought, I don't want you to be sorry. I want you to be wrong. Here is the thing that nobody in that elevator knew, that nobody would know for years. Izuku's toe bone was not the whole story. It wasn't even really the important part of the story. It was just the part medicine had a test for. Somewhere behind his sternum, coiled tight and dormant like a seed buried too deep to find sun, something else was waiting. It had been waiting since before he was born, since some genetic lottery no scientist would ever be able to explain. Since some crossing of causality that belonged to a world Izuku Midoriya's world didn't officially know existed, folded something into him that had nothing to do with quirks at all. It would be years before he'd have a word for it. He would call it, eventually and privately, in a battered notebook with a lock he'd bought with 3 weeks of allowance, the flow. Later still, much, much later, standing in a room with a man whose title he would never fully believe he deserved, he would learn the word other people used for it, a word from a discipline as old and separate from the world of quirks as two rivers that had somehow, impossibly, decided to cross. Cursed energy. But at 10 years old, in a small apartment in Mizurufu, all Izuku Midoriya knew was this: he was quirkless. The doctor had said so. The X-ray had said so. His toe bone, of all the unfair and arbitrary things in the world, had said so. He didn't know that his eyes, at that very moment, already carried the faintest trace of a pattern that had not existed in his irises the week before. 6 rings, so pale and so subtle that not even Dr. Tsubasa, staring directly into them through his little penlight not 20 minutes earlier, had noticed anything at all. He didn't know that won't develop a quirk and will develop nothing were two very, very different sentences. He just knew that he'd cried in an elevator, and that his hero notebooks were still sitting on his desk at home, 11 of them now, spines cracked from being opened and closed and pored over so many times, and that he didn't know, walking back into the apartment that afternoon, whether he was still allowed to want what was written in them. he kept them anyway. That part, at least, nobody's diagnosis could take from him. Katsuki Bakugo's quirk had come in loud, the way everything about Katsuki came in loud. It happened on a Tuesday in the summer between 3rd and 4th grade, in the little concrete lot behind their apartment complex where the neighborhood kids played after school. Izuku remembered it in pieces, the way memory tends to preserve the moments that matter more than it preserves the moments around them. Katsuki holding his hands out, palms up, showing off a scraped knuckle to a knot of other boys. Someone, Izuku never found out who, saying something about how Katsuki was all talk, no quirk yet, big man with nothing to back it up, and then a sound like a firecracker, and a smell like burnt sugar and gunpowder, and Katsuki's palms crackling with small orange sparks, and Katsuki's face. Izuku would never forget Katsuki's face in that moment, going from surprise to delighted in under a second. The particular delight of a boy discovering that the world had just confirmed something he'd always suspected about himself, that he was special. That he was going to be someone. Whoa, said one of the other boys, and it wasn't fear yet, not exactly, but it was the beginning of something that would eventually calcify into fear, or into worship, or, in a handful of unlucky cases, Izuku's included, into something more complicated than either. Izuku had been there. Izuku had clapped. He remembered clapping, genuinely, without a shred of jealousy, because at 9 years old Katsuki Bakugo was still, despite everything that would come later, his best friend, and Izuku loved him the uncomplicated way boys that age love each other, which is to say completely and without much examination. Kaken, that's so cool, he'd said, and he'd meant it with his whole small heart. You're gonna be the best hero ever. Katsuki had grinned at him, a real grin, not yet the sneer it would curdle into, and said obviously, I'm gonna be way better than All Might. You'll see, Deku. Deku. Even the nickname had been affectionate once. A pun on Izuku's own name, on the character for Kant, Dekunobo, useless, that Katsuki had started calling him not out of cruelty but out of the easy, careless teasing that exists between kids who trust each other enough to tease. It would take on new, sharper meaning later. Everything from that summer would take on new, sharper meaning later. The diagnosis came a year after that. And a year is a long time when you are 10 and your best friend can now, on command, produce controlled detonations from the sweat glands in his palms, and you cannot. Izuku noticed the shift before Katsuki said anything cruel about it, which was, in its own way, the worst part. He noticed it in the half-second pause before Katsuki decided whether to invite him into a game. He noticed it in the way the other boys' eyes moved to Katsuki first now, for permission, before they moved to Izuku at all. He noticed it in small, cumulative erosions, being picked second to last, then not picked at all. Not out of malice exactly, but out of a kind of thoughtless calculus that 10-year-olds perform without cruelty in mind. He can't do anything, so what's the point? The cruelty came later, and when it came from Katsuki, and it came dressed as something else entirely, not hatred, but a kind of furious, uncomprehending contempt that Izuku would spend years failing to understand. You're still gonna try for UA? Katsuki said one afternoon, not long after the diagnosis had made its way around the building through the particular grapevine that exists among mothers who see each other in stairwells. They were sitting on the low concrete wall by the lot, and Katsuki wasn't looking at him, was instead flicking small, controlled sparks off his fingertips into the dirt, watching them fizzle out one by one. Everyone knows you're quirkless now, Deku. I can still try, Izuku said. His voice came out smaller than he wanted. Lots of heroes started without. Name one. Izuku opened his mouth. Closed it. He would, eventually, be able to name several. He'd spend the next 4 years building an entire case study out of exactly this question. But at 10 years old, standing in the shadow of his best friend's growing power, he had nothing ready. See? Katsuki said, and there was something almost desperate in the way he said it. Something Izuku wouldn't understand until much, much later, that Katsuki Bakugo, even at 10, even flush with the brand new quirk and the adoration of every kid in the neighborhood, was terrified of being ordinary, and that Izuku's quirklessness had become, in some twisted corner of Katsuki's mind, proof that the world did sort people into winners and losers, and Katsuki needed very badly to believe he'd been sorted correctly. You can't be a hero without a quirk. That's just how it works. Stop being stupid about it. It was the first time Katsuki had ever called him stupid. It would not be the last. The strange things started small enough that Izuku, for a long time, didn't register them as strange at all. They were more like glitches, moments where the world seemed to skip a frame, the way an old DVD sometimes did, and then correct itself so fast that he was never sure it had happened at all. The first one he could remember clearly happened about 8 months after Katsuki's quirk manifested, on the same concrete lot. During a game that had stopped including Izuku as a player and started including him only as an audience, which he told himself he didn't mind, because at least it meant he still got to watch. Katsuki was showing off. He'd graduated from small crackling sparks to something with real force behind it now, a little cone of superheated air that could knock a soda can clean off the wall from 10 feet away. And he was doing exactly that, over and over, to the delighted shrieking of the smaller kids who'd gathered to watch. Deku, catch, Katsuki said, not kindly, more like a dare, the kind of dare that expected failure, and flicked a small spark in Izuku's direction. It wasn't meant to hurt, not really. It was the kind of spark Katsuki used to punctuate sentences by then. Barely bigger than a sparkler's flame, more insult than attack. Izuku moved his hand. He didn't decide to move his hand. That was the strange part, the part that would nag at him for days afterward. 1 second the spark was arcing toward his palm. Not fast, Katsuki hadn't put any real force behind it, and the next second Izuku's hand had simply shifted, an inch, maybe 2, with an economy of motion that felt less like flinching and more like he'd known exactly, with total certainty, precisely where the spark was going to be a half second before it got there. The spark fizzled against the concrete wall behind him instead, leaving a small black scorch mark that was still there, faded, years later. Huh, Katsuki said, frowning, not suspicious yet, just mildly annoyed the way he got when something didn't go the way he expected. Lucky. Yeah, Izuku said, staring at his own hand like it belonged to someone else. Lucky. It happened again, a few weeks later, with a soccer ball. They were playing, or rather, Izuku was standing at the edge of a game he'd been allowed to half-join, in the position furthest from anything important, which even at that age he understood was a kind of mercy, and the ball got away from the pack, rolling fast toward the storm drain at the edge of the lot, the one everyone knew swallowed balls forever if they went in. Izuku was easily 15 feet away. He remembered, with the strange clarity that certain memories acquire, thinking with pure and simple dread, it's going to go in, it's going to be my fault somehow, someone's going to be mad, and then the ball simply wasn't rolling toward the drain anymore. It was rolling toward him. Not fast, not dramatically, just redirected, as though something invisible had reached out and nudged its path a few crucial degrees, the exact few degrees needed to send it curving gently to a stop at Izuku's feet instead of vanishing into the dark. Nobody else seemed to notice. Kids that age rarely track the physics of a rolling ball that closely. It had simply, in their eyes, missed the drain, the way balls sometimes did. But Izuku noticed. Izuku noticed because for 1/2 second, right as the ball changed direction, he had felt something. Not a sound, not quite a feeling in his body, more like a pressure behind his eyes. A kind of reaching sensation, gone as fast as it arrived, like a muscle he didn't know he had briefly, involuntarily, flexed. He didn't tell anyone. What would he even have said? I think I made the ball turn with my mind sounded, even to 10-year-old Izuku, like exactly the kind of thing a sad, desperate quirkless kid would say to try to convince himself he wasn't as ordinary as a hospital x-ray insisted he was. He'd read enough forum posts by then, lurking, late at night, on message boards for quirkless kids and their parents, to know the shape of that particular self-delusion. Phantom quirk syndrome, one thread had called it, with a clinical cruelty that had made 10-year-old Izuku close the laptop and not open it again for a week. Quirkless kids sometimes convinced themselves they had small, subtle powers, a knack for luck, a feeling for danger, because the alternative, accepting that they truly had nothing, was too heavy to carry every day. I'm imagining it, Izuku told himself, and wrote nothing down, and went home, and didn't think about it again for almost 2 months. The third time was harder to explain away, because this time, someone else saw it too. It was autumn by then, the leaves starting to go orange along the little strip of park between Izuku's apartment complex and his elementary school, and Izuku was walking home alone, increasingly the way he walked most places now, since the friend group that had once included him by default now excluded him by an equally thoughtless default. When Katsuki caught up to him from behind. This was not, by then, a friendly occurrence. Katsuki caught up to him maybe once every few weeks, and it was never to talk about video games anymore, never to compare hero rankings the way they used to. It was, more often than not, to remind Izuku, with words that had gotten sharper and meaner as the months passed, as though Katsuki needed the reminder repeated more forcefully each time to keep believing it himself. Exactly where the two of them now stood in relation to each other. Oh, Deku. Izuku's shoulders went up around his ears, an old, tired reflex by now. He didn't turn around. Hi Kaken, don't hi Kaken me. Footsteps fast, closing the distance. Izuku heard the familiar crackle pop of a small warning spark, the sound Katsuki's palms made now almost constantly, an idle habit like cracking knuckles. I heard you're still filling out that stupid notebook. The hero one. With me in it. Izuku's stomach dropped. He was still filling out the notebook number 13 by then, with an entire section, carefully labeled, analyzing Katsuki's quirk from every angle Izuku could observe. Blast radius, sweat-based fuel mechanics, probable weaknesses, dehydration, cold environments, anything that reduced perspiration, probable growth trajectory. He hadn't meant for anyone to see it. He definitely hadn't meant for Katsuki to hear about it secondhand from whoever had blabbed. It's not. I wasn't making fun of you, Izuku started, turning around now, hands already up in the universal gesture of a boy trying to de-escalate something he could feel accelerating past the point of words. I was just trying to understand your quirk better, so I could write about. Understand it? Katsuki's voice cracked upward, incredulous, furious in the specific way he only ever got with Izuku, a fury that had no real equivalent with anyone else in his life. His palms were sparking harder now, little orange flickers gathering at his fingertips like static electricity building toward a real discharge. What the hell do you need to understand my quirk for? You don't even have one. You're just gonna, cheer from the sidelines forever? Write little essays about the guys who actually get to do something? That's not. Give me the notebook. Kaken, I don't have it with me, it's at. I said give it to me. And this was the part that Izuku would replay, later, again and again, trying to understand what exactly had happened, because it happened too fast for his conscious mind to catch, the way all of it had happened too fast so far. Katsuki lunged, not really meaning to hurt him. Izuku understood even in the moment, more the physical equivalent of grabbing someone by the collar, an aggressive shove more than a real attack. But his hand came up sparking as it moved, an involuntary discharge, the kind of small accidental pop his quirk still sometimes let loose when his emotions ran too hot for his 10-year-old control to manage. It should have caught Izuku across the forearm. It was close enough, fast enough, that there was no version of ordinary human reflexes that got a hand out of the way in time. Izuku's hand was already somewhere else. Not far, 6 inches, maybe 8, enough to let the spark pop harmlessly into empty air where his arm had been a half-second before. But the movement had a quality to it that even Katsuki, red-faced and furious, seemed to register as wrong. Izuku hadn't flinched backward, the ordinary panicked full-body recoil of someone dodging a threat. His hand alone had moved, precisely, economically, exactly the necessary distance and not 1 inch more, with the eerie efficiency of someone who had known, with total, absolute certainty, the spark's exact trajectory before Katsuki's arm had even finished extending. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Katsuki's spark fizzled out against the pavement. The autumn leaves kept falling, indifferent, around them. The hell was that? Katsuki said. It wasn't really a question. His fury had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere confused and, underneath the confusion, something that might have been. Izuku almost couldn't believe it. Looking back on it later, something that might have been the first flicker of fear. I don't know, Izuku said honestly, and his own voice came out shaking, because he genuinely, truly did not know. I didn't. I wasn't trying to do anything, Kaken, I swear I just... You're quirkless. Katsuki said it like an accusation now, like Izuku had broken some rule by moving that fast, that precisely, without the equipment that was supposed to make it possible. You're not supposed to be able to do that. I know, then how? I don't know. Izuku's voice cracked, and to his own horror he felt his eyes going hot again, the same helpless heat from the elevator all those months ago. I don't know, okay, it just happened, like the ball, and I don't know, Kaken, please don't be mad, I wasn't trying to show off, I would never. Whatever Katsuki had been about to say, he didn't get the chance to say it, because at that exact moment Izuku's mother's voice carried down the street. She'd come out looking for him, unusual but not unheard of, worried because he was later than expected, and the two boys sprang apart the way boys that age instinctively spring apart from any moment too big and confusing for an adult to walk in on. I'll figure out what your deal is, Katsuki said low, as he turned to go, and there was something in his voice that Izuku hadn't heard from him before, not the easy contempt of the last several months, but something colder, something that would calcify, over the following years, into an obsession Izuku wouldn't fully understand the shape of until it was far too late to head off gently. You're hiding something. I'm gonna find out what. He was, in the end, exactly right. It would just take him considerably longer than either of them expected. That night, Izuku sat on the floor of his room with notebook 13 open in front of him, pen hovering over a blank page, and did not write anything for almost 20 minutes. He'd never not known what to write before. That was, in a strange way, the thing that had always made him him. The compulsive need to put observations into words, to build a taxonomy out of a world that mostly ignored him, to feel, at least on paper, like he understood something about the powers other kids got to wield in their bodies while he only got to wield a pen. But this, the ball, the spark, the way his hand had known things his mind hadn't told it, didn't fit into any of the categories he built. It wasn't a hero's quirk he was analyzing from a safe, admiring distance. It was something happening inside him, and he had no framework for that at all. He wrote, eventually, at the top of a fresh page, "Things I can't explain." Under it, in his small, careful handwriting, he made a list. 1. The spark from Bakugo's quirk on the wall, lucky? 2. The soccer ball at the drain, lucky? 3. Today. Not lucky. I knew before it happened. I felt something before it happened. Like a pulling? A pressure? Behind my eyes maybe. Or in my chest. He chewed the end of the pen. Then, underneath smaller, like he was embarrassed to even write it down where someone might someday see it. Am I making this up? Doctor said I'm quirkless. Mom believes doctor. I believe doctor. But what if the doctor is wrong about some of it? Not the being a hero part. Maybe he's right about that. But what if there's something else that isn't a quirk but also isn't nothing? He stared at the page for a long time. Outside, he could hear his mother in the kitchen, the comforting domestic clatter of dinner dishes being put away, the murmur of the evening news. Ordinary sounds. A life that was supposed to be ordinary, that his diagnosis had confirmed would be ordinary, laid out neatly in front of him like a map with all the interesting roads already crossed out. He closed the notebook. He told himself, the way he'd been telling himself for months, that it didn't matter, that even if something strange was happening to him, it clearly wasn't a quirk, it hadn't shown up on the X-ray, it hadn't shown up in any test, and a hero needed a quirk, real force, real power, not vague feelings of pressure behind his eyes that made a soccer ball roll a few degrees off course. He put the notebook under his mattress, in the spot he was starting to reserve specifically for the things he didn't know how to say out loud yet, and he went to sleep telling himself it was nothing. It was, of course, not nothing. It would be years before he understood exactly how much it was not nothing. But that night, in the dark, with his mother's television murmuring faintly through the wall and his best friend who wasn't anymore's threats still ringing in his ears, 10-year-old Izuku Midoriya fell asleep the way he fell asleep most nights that year, quietly, alone, and afraid that the thing that made him different was not a secret gift waiting to be discovered, but a flaw waiting to be found out. The weeks that followed were, on the surface, unremarkable. School continued. Izuku's isolation from the other boys in his grade continued, deepening in the slow, unglamorous way that childhood cruelty usually deepens, not through dramatic confrontations but through 1,000 small omissions, a seat not saved, a group chat he was quietly dropped from, a birthday party he wasn't invited to that he found out about only because half his class showed up to school the following Monday still buzzing about it. He threw himself, as he always did when the world outside got too heavy to hold, into the notebooks. Notebook 13 filled up. He started Notebook 14. He began, almost as an experiment, dedicating a few pages at the back, separate from the hero analysis, separate even from the things I can't explain list, which he'd since transferred, growing steadily longer, into its own private section, to something he didn't have a name for yet. He called it, with the careful, hedging language of a kid who didn't want to commit to a claim he couldn't back up, weird stuff, maybe nothing. The entries accumulated slowly. Caught a book falling off my shelf without looking up from my homework. Didn't even really move my hand, it just sort of stopped falling for a second before I grabbed it. Weird. Felt the pressure thing again during gym. Dodgeball. Didn't get hit once, even by Sato, who throws really hard. Coach said I have good instincts. I don't think it's instincts. Mom dropped a mug. I was across the kitchen. I don't know how to explain what happened except that for a second it felt like the distance between me and the mug got smaller without me moving, and then I was holding it. Mom didn't notice. Said nice reflexes, Izuku, and like it was normal. It didn't feel normal. It felt like something reached out that wasn't my arm. He never showed the notebook to anyone. Not his mother, who he loved fiercely and completely and who he was, for the first time in his life, keeping a real secret from, not out of malice, but out of a fear he couldn't quite name, a fear that saying it out loud would either make it true in a way that terrified him, or make it definitively, humiliatingly false, and he wasn't sure which outcome scared him more. Not Katsuki, obviously. That relationship had curdled past the point where Izuku could imagine handing him anything vulnerable ever again. There was no one else. That was, in its own quiet way, the saddest fact of that autumn. A 10-year-old boy accumulating evidence of something genuinely extraordinary happening inside his own body, with absolutely no one in his life he trusted enough to tell. It happened, finally, the moment the outline of this story would come to call, much later, with a kind of grim reverence, the first real one, on a Tuesday evening in early November, 3 weeks after the incident with Katsuki's spark. Izuku was in his room. It had been, by the ordinary metrics of his life that year, a bad day. Not dramatically bad, no single terrible event, just the low, grinding kind of bad that came from being quietly excluded from a group project, then quietly excluded from the after-school walk home, then arriving at an empty apartment because his mother was working a late shift, and sitting alone with a bowl of reheated curry that he barely tasted. He'd set up his desk the way he always did in the evenings, notebooks open, small figures of his favorite heroes arranged along the shelf above it in a careful, curated lineup. Empty lady, backdraft, ingenium, and, at the center, in the place of honor, an all-might figure his mother had bought him 2 birthdays ago, back before the diagnosis, back when buying her son hero merchandise had still felt like buying him a future instead of a small, sad consolation. He was reaching for a pencil when his elbow caught the edge of the shelf. It happened in slow motion, the way small domestic disasters always seem to. In that horrible stretched-out half-second where you can see exactly what's about to go wrong and are somehow still too slow to stop it. The all-might figure teetered, tipped, and fell, not far, only a few feet, off the shelf and past the edge of the desk, angling toward the narrow gap between the desk and the wall where it would inevitably vanish into a nest of dust and cables that Izuku's mother had been asking him to clean for 3 months. No, no, no. Izuku lunged physically, his whole body twisting toward the fall. But he was too far, his hand nowhere close, the figure already past the point where an ordinary human arm could intervene, and then it wasn't falling anymore. It simply appeared in his outstretched palm, no arc, no trajectory Izuku's eyes could follow, the way an object appears in a photograph taken a half-second before you thought the shutter clicked, there and then here, with nothing in between that his mind could construct into a coherent motion. Izuku went very, very still. He was crouched half off his chair, one hand extended, All Might's small plastic figure clutched in his fingers, and his heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the fall itself. The fall had been nothing, 6 inches, no danger to speak of, and everything to do with the wrongness of what had just happened, a wrongness his whole body seemed to recognize even before his mind caught up to it, because this time, he'd felt it. Really felt it, not the vague pressure behind the eyes sensation from before, but something enormous and precise and close, like a muscle flexing somewhere he didn't have muscles, like reaching an arm through a gap that existed for exactly the length of time it took to close, and closing it again, all so fast that if he blinked he would have missed the entire sensation. He looked down at his hand. At the All Might figure, safe, undamaged, resting in his palm exactly as though it had never fallen at all. What, Izuku whispered to the empty room, was that? The room didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But something, somewhere, deep beneath his sternum, in the place where a seed had been folded into him before birth and had been waiting, patiently dormant, for something to finally begin to crack it open, something answered instead. It was not a voice. Izuku would spend a long time, later, trying to describe it to himself in the private pages of a new notebook, one he'd eventually buy a lock for, and he would never quite manage it. It was closer to a sound felt in the body than heard by the ears. Low, wooden, groaning, like an enormous wheel turning somewhere it had no business turning, somewhere inside his own chest. Slow and heavy and ancient in a way that made the small hairs on Izuku's arms stand up despite the warm evening air. It lasted less than a second. It was gone before Izuku could even fully register it as sound rather than sensation, before his mind could do anything with it except file it, immediately and instinctively, under the same growing category as everything else that year, unexplainable. Do not tell anyone. Figure it out alone. He sat frozen for a long moment afterward, the All Might figure still clutched tight in his fist, his own breathing loud in the quiet apartment. Then, slowly, carefully, the way you might set down something you weren't sure was safe to touch, he placed the figure back on the shelf. He looked at his hand, turned it over, flexed the fingers, as though expecting it to look different somehow, to carry some visible mark of what it had just done. It looked exactly the same. Small, a little ink-stained from an afternoon of note-taking, entirely ordinary. He got up. He walked to the small mirror mounted on the back of his closet door, a habit from years of practicing hero poses in front of it, one he mostly abandoned since the diagnosis but never quite fully given up, and he looked at his own reflection for a long time. His eyes looked the same too. Green, a little red-rimmed from the day's small accumulated hurts, unremarkable in every way a 10-year-old's eyes are unremarkable. He did not know, could not have known, not yet, not for years, that if he had looked closer, if the light had caught them at exactly the right angle, he might have seen, faint as a watermark, 6 pale rings beginning to form around each iris, a pattern that belonged to no known genetic marker on Earth, a pattern that a very different sort of teacher, in a very different sort of school, on the far side of a divide between two worlds that were never supposed to touch, would have recognized instantly, and would have wept a little, to see on the face of a child so far from anyone who could teach him what it meant. Izuku just saw his own tired, ordinary face. He turned off the light. He got into bed, curled around the small, cold certainty that something in him had changed and that he had absolutely no one to tell. Somewhere far beneath his ribs, in the dark, something ancient and coiled and endlessly patient settled back down to sleep. Not gone. Never gone. Just waiting, the way it had always waited, the way it would keep waiting, for the day its vessel needed it badly enough to wake it fully. That day was not today, but it was coming. And when it came, it would not ask Izuku Midoriya's permission. His mother came home a little after 10, tired from her shift, apologizing for being late the way she always apologized for things that weren't remotely her fault. She found Izuku already in bed, eyes closed, breathing slow and even in the specific, deliberate way of a child pretending to be asleep so as not to have to explain a day he didn't have words for yet. She stood in his doorway for a moment, the hallway light behind her casting a long gold rectangle across his floor, and she looked at her son, small, curled on his side, one hand still faintly curled the way it had been curled around a plastic figure an hour before. Though she didn't know that, and she felt the particular ache that mothers feel looking at children they cannot fully protect from a world that has already, quietly, decided what that child is and isn't allowed to become. "Good night, Izuku," she whispered, and closed the door softly, and went to bed herself, exhausted, with no idea at all that 6 pale rings had, for one fraction of a second earlier that evening, flickered into visibility in her son's eyes before fading again into the ordinary green she'd looked into 10,000 times before. Down the hall, Izuku lay awake a long time after the apartment went quiet, staring at the ceiling, running the evening over and over in his mind, the fall, the catch, The impossible closing of a gap that should have taken him a full second longer to cross, and beneath it all, that low, wooden, sleeping groan. A sound like something enormous turning over in a sleep it had no intention of waking fully from. Not yet. He didn't have a word for any of it. Not cursed energy. Not limitless. Not Mahoraga, a name that belonged to an entirely different mythology, on the other side of a boundary between worlds that Izuku Midoriya, 10 years old and quietly, secretly extraordinary, did not yet know existed. All he had was a feeling, small, private, and terrifying in its implications, that the doctor had been wrong about something. Not about the toe joint. Not about the quirk. Dr. Tsubasa had been entirely correct about all of that, and would remain correct about it for the rest of Izuku's life. He would never, not once, develop a quirk in the conventional sense the word implied in a world built around that single genetic marker. But won't develop a quirk and has nothing at all were, it turned out, very different sentences indeed. And somewhere in the gap between those two sentences, in the 6 pale rings not yet fully formed around a 10-year-old's eyes, in the low wooden groan of something ancient stirring beneath his ribs, in the small, unremarkable miracle of a plastic action figure caught mid-fall by a hand that had crossed 6 inches of empty air faster than any human reflex should allow, an entirely different story was, already quietly, patiently, beginning to write itself. Izuku Midoriya closed his eyes, at last, and slept. He did not dream, that night, of All Might, or of hero costumes, or of the future he'd been so carefully told to stop hoping for. He dreamed, instead, of a great slow wheel turning in the dark, and did not understand, waking the next morning with only the faintest, half-remembered impression of it, that it had not been a dream at all. The notebook he bought the lock for was black, cheap, the kind sold in a 3-pack at the convenience store near the train station. And he bought it with money he'd saved specifically for the purpose over 6 weeks of skip snacks, not because anyone would have questioned him buying a notebook, but because buying the lock separately, in cash, at a different store, felt like the kind of precaution a person in a spy movie would take, and 11-year-old Izuku had, by that point, started to feel less like a boy keeping a diary and more like a person managing a classified file. He wrote personal, hero analysis number 17 on the cover, in the same handwriting he used for all his other notebooks, because if his mother ever saw the spine on the shelf she needed to see exactly what she expected to see. It was only once you opened it, past the first several pages, which were, in fact, real hero analysis, real observations about quirk mechanics culled from news footage and interviews, decoy pages, camouflage, that you'd find the section he'd started calling, in the privacy of his own head, the real notebook. The real notebook did not have a title. Izuku had tried several, weird stuff, which felt too childish now, observations, which felt like something a scientist would write, and he didn't feel he'd earned that yet, the thing, which he'd used for exactly 1 entry before deciding it sounded too much like a monster movie, and had settled, finally, on simply starting each entry with a date and letting the content speak for itself. The entries, by the winter after his diagnosis, numbered in the dozens. November 30th. Caught myself seeing the shape of a car's headlights on the wall before the car actually turned the corner. Like there was a kind of outline there first, and then the real thing filled it in a second later. This is new. Didn't happen before. Is it getting stronger? December 4th. Pulled my backpack strap toward my hand from across the room without meaning to. It was like tugging on an invisible string, except there wasn't a string, and I didn't tug. I just wanted it, and then it was closer. Felt the pressure behind the eyes thing very strong this time. Almost got a headache after. December 9th. Mom asked why I was staring at the wall for so long at dinner. I wasn't staring at the wall. I was looking at the space between me and the wall. I don't know how to explain what I mean by that even to myself. It's like there's a kind of grid or measurement I can feel now if I concentrate. Distances. I can feel distances the way I can feel temperature. That last entry marked, though Izuku didn't know it yet and wouldn't have the language for it for years, the first conscious flicker of 6 eyes beginning to surface, not the full, effortless omniscient perception it would eventually become, but its earliest and clumsiest form, a faint awareness of space itself as something measurable, something readable, the way a colorblind man might begin, for the first time in his life, to notice that certain grays weren't quite the same gray as other grays. He didn't know what it meant. He only knew it was getting stronger, and that it scared him exactly as much as it fascinated him, and that those two feelings had started, somewhere around Notebook 17, to feel less like opposites and more like two sides of the exact same coin. The dodgeball incident happened in early December, during the last PE class before winter break, and it was the first time Izuku understood, really understood, with the sinking clarity of watching a mistake happen in real time and being unable to stop it, that whatever was growing inside him was not a private matter anymore. It had an audience now. It always would, from that point forward. Dodgeball at Izuku's elementary school was, like dodgeball at most elementary schools, less a sport than a controlled venue for boys to work out whatever aggression the week had built up in them, and Katsuki Bakugo, predictably, dominated it, not through any use of his quirk, which was against the rules, but through sheer velocity and a competitive streak that had only sharpened in the years since his powers manifested. Izuku, historically, was picked somewhere in the bottom third and eliminated within the first 30 seconds, a pattern so consistent it had become almost comforting in its predictability. Nobody expected anything of him on the dodgeball court, which meant nobody watched him closely enough to notice anything strange. That day, something had shifted. It started small. A ball from the opposing line, thrown by a boy named Sato who had, over the past year, developed a genuinely frightening arm, came arcing toward Izuku's midsection at a speed that should have ended his round instantly, the way it had ended his round in every single dodgeball game for the past 6 years of his life. Izuku's body moved before his mind caught up to it, a small pivot at the waist, a half-step back, timed with a precision that felt, in the moment, less like reflexes and more like knowledge, as though some part of him had already watched the ball complete its trajectory, and was simply replaying the correct response a half-second ahead of the actual throw. The ball missed him by perhaps 2 inches. "Whoa, nice dodge, Midoriya!" Someone called from the sideline, not unkindly, mostly surprised, and Izuku felt a small, unfamiliar flush of pride warm his chest, the first time in longer than he could remember that anyone had said anything about him during a PE class that wasn't a groan of disappointment at being stuck on his team. It should have ended there. A lucky dodge, quickly forgotten, filed away by his classmates under the same vague category good instincts that his mother had used months earlier about the falling mug. It did not end there, because the pride made him careless, and the carelessness made him keep dodging, and by the third throw, and the fourth, and the fifth, it stopped looking like luck to anyone watching, even to 11-year-olds not remotely trained to notice such things. It started looking like something else. Something eerie. Something that made the other kids' eyes narrow instead of light up. Izuku didn't notice the shift in the room's mood until the 6th throw, the one that finally, mercifully, ended his round, not because he'd made a mistake, but because he deliberately let it hit him, some instinctive, self-preserving part of his brain finally catching up to the social catastrophe unfolding around him and hitting the brakes hard. The ball caught him in the shoulder. He went down, sitting hard on the gym floor, and the sting of the impact was almost a relief. The gym had gone quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when something doesn't add up, when a dozen kids simultaneously feel a small wrongness they don't have words for. Izuku looked up from the floor to find every eye in the room on him, not admiring, not the way they'd looked at Katsuki a year earlier when his quirk first manifested, but wary, the particular wariness reserved for something that doesn't fit into any of the categories a person's understanding of the world has room for. "How'd you do that?" a boy near the wall asked. Kimura, one of the kids who'd never been outright cruel to Izuku but had drifted away from him along with everyone else, following the same thoughtless social gravity. "You're quirkless. You're not supposed to be able to dodge like that." "I don't know," Izuku said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to, the same helpless smallness from the day with Katsuki's spark. "I just got lucky, I guess." 6 times in a row?" Sato said from across the court, his frightening arm hanging loose at his side, his expression somewhere between impressed and unsettled. "That's not luck, man." Katsuki hadn't said anything yet. Izuku found him at the edge of the court, arms crossed, and the expression on his face was one Izuku had never seen there before, not the sneering contempt of the past year, not the easy affection of the years before that, but something colder and more focused, an expression of active, deliberate calculation, the look of someone filing information away for later use. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. Katsuki didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Izuku understood, with total clarity, exactly what that look meant. I told you I'd figure out your deal. I'm getting closer. The teacher, Mr. Oyama, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had never shown much interest in the social undercurrents of his students' lives, clapped his hands and called the next round, the way teachers do when they sense something is wrong but lack either the tools or the inclination to address it directly, and the game moved on. And by the time the bell rang for lunch, most of the class had already half forgotten the strangeness of it in the way children's attention moves quickly from one novelty to the next. Izuku did not forget it. Izuku thought about almost nothing else for the rest of the day. That night, Notebook 17 received its longest entry yet. December 12th. This is bad. I dodged 6 dodgeballs in a row today, and everyone noticed. I wasn't even trying to show off, I just could do it. The way I could feel the ball's path before it left the other kid's hand. The same way I could see the outline of the car headlights before the car turned the corner. It's like the more this happens, the easier it gets to notice it happening, and I don't know how to make it stop. I let the 6th one hit me on purpose. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Kimura asked how I did it, and I said lucky, but nobody believed me, I could tell. Kaken didn't say anything the whole time, but he looked at me the way you look at a puzzle you're almost done solving. I don't like that look. I liked it better when he just thought I was nothing. Being nothing was safer than being a puzzle. I keep thinking about the doctor. He said I'm quirkless. He said it with total certainty, like there was no room to be wrong about it. But what if there's a difference between doesn't have a quirk and doesn't have anything? What if whatever this is isn't a quirk at all, but something else? Something the doctor's test doesn't even check for. I don't have a name for it. I don't know anyone who would know what to call it. I don't even know if it's safe to ask. He paused there, pen hovering, and then wrote one more line, smaller than the rest, the kind of sentence a person writes only when they're certain no one else will ever read it. I'm a little bit scared of myself. Is that a normal thing to feel? He closed the notebook. He locked it. He put it under his mattress in the spot reserved for it, and he lay awake a long time that night listening to his own heartbeat, wondering, not for the first time, and far from the last, whether the thing growing inside him was a gift he hadn't been told how to unwrap, or a flaw with a shape too large and too strange for anyone, even a doctor with a penlight and an X-ray machine, to properly diagnose. The eyes changed for the first time, visibly, undeniably, in a way that could not be explained away by a trick of light or a tired mother's imagination. 3 weeks later, on a night that started, like most of the worst nights of Izuku's childhood, entirely ordinarily. It was a Friday. His mother had picked up an extra shift, which meant Izuku had the apartment to himself for the evening, a fact that had once made him anxious and now, increasingly, felt like relief. An evening without having to arrange his face into an expression that wouldn't worry her, without having to decide, moment to moment, how much of the strange growing thing inside him to let show. He'd been experimenting. Carefully. Methodically, the way he approached everything, with Notebook 17 open on his desk and a stopwatch borrowed from his mother's junk drawer, testing, cautiously, in the small enclosed safety of his own bedroom, exactly how far the pulling sensation could reach, and how precisely he could control it. He'd started small. A pencil, 6 inches away, resting on the edge of his desk. He reached toward it with his hand and, at the same time, reached toward it with the other thing, the thing he still didn't have a name for, the pressure behind the eyes sensation, the feeling of a distance becoming readable, becoming, if he concentrated hard enough, something he could touch without touching. The pencil rolled half an inch toward his outstretched fingers. He tried it again. A pen this time, farther away, a full foot, near the edge of the bookshelf. He held very still, closed his eyes, and thought, with as much focus as an 11-year-old boy could muster, closer. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, so gently it was almost impossible to be sure it wasn't his imagination, the pen rolled 2 inches toward the desk's edge. Izuku's heart was pounding now, not with fear exactly, but with something adjacent to it, the specific electric thrill of standing at the edge of a discovery too large to fully comprehend yet. He opened his eyes and looked at his own hands, spread in front of him, ordinary and unchanged, and thought, what are you? He tried once more, pushing further this time, a heavier object, a small stack of manga volumes on the far side of his desk, a good 2 feet away, farther than anything he'd successfully moved before. He concentrated harder than he ever had in his life. That same pulling sensation building behind his eyes, sharper now, almost painful, like trying to lift something heavier than his muscles were built for. The top volume of the stack didn't just roll. It leapt, 6 inches straight up off the pile and into the air, tumbling once, before landing hard on the desk with a bang that made Izuku flinch backwards so violently he nearly fell out of his chair. For a long moment he simply sat there, breathing hard, staring at the fallen manga volume with something between terror and awe. And then he caught, out of the corner of his eye, his own reflection in the small mirror mounted on the back of his closet door, and he went very, very still. His eyes were wrong. Not wrong in a way he could have described to anyone else without sounding insane. The shape was the same, the color was still, ostensibly, green. But there was something layered into them now that had not been there that morning, something that had not been there, he was almost certain, an hour ago. Faint rings, pale and shimmering, concentric circles radiating outward from his pupils like ripples frozen mid-spread across the surface of a pond, visible only if the light caught them at exactly the right angle, but undeniably, unmistakably there. He leaned closer to the mirror, close enough that his breath fogged the glass, and stared, transfixed, terrified, unable to look away. The rings pulsed, faintly, in time with his own racing heartbeat. And as he watched, the pressure behind his eyes, the same pressure he'd been chasing and cultivating for the past hour, seemed to sharpen into something entirely new, something he had never felt before, an awareness, sudden and total, of everything in the room at once. Not just the manga volume, not just the pencil and the pen he'd been testing on, but every object, every surface, every measurable distance between every point in the space around him, all of it arriving in his mind simultaneously with a clarity so overwhelming it made his knees go weak. He could feel, no, he could see, though see wasn't quite the right word either, was too small a word for what was happening, the exact distance between his desk chair and his bookshelf, the precise angle of the crack in his bedroom window that he never noticed before, the faint, almost imperceptible sway of the ceiling light on its cord, a motion so small no ordinary eye would ever register it, laid out for him now with the same clarity, as if someone had handed him a diagram with every measurement labeled. It was too much. It was instantly, overwhelmingly too much, a flood of information his 11-year-old brain had absolutely no framework for processing, and he clapped his hands over his own eyes, gasping, and the pressure receded as fast as it had come, leaving him hunched over his desk, shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he finally worked up the courage to lower his hands and look at the mirror again, his eyes were ordinary. Green. Unremarkable. The rings had vanished as completely as if they'd never been there at all. He sat very still for a long time after that, staring at his own reflection, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't. Not that night. But he knew, with the same absolute certainty that had settled into him the day the doctor delivered his diagnosis, that something fundamental about him had just changed, permanently and irreversibly, and that he had no idea, none at all, what it meant, or what it would eventually cost him. He didn't write about the eyes in Notebook 17 that night. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too badly to hold the pen steady, and some deeper, more instinctive part of him understood, even before he could articulate why, that this particular discovery was too large and too frightening to commit to paper yet, that writing it down would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for. He wrote about it 3 days later instead, once the shaking had stopped and the memory had settled into something he could look at without his stomach turning over. December 30th. My eyes changed. I don't know how else to say it. There were rings in them, like circles, rippling out from the middle, and when they appeared I could suddenly feel /see/sense. I don't have the right word, everything around me at once. Distances. Angles. Things I shouldn't be able to notice. Like the sway of a lamp cord nobody would ever look at twice. It only lasted a few seconds and then it went away and my eyes looked normal again. I don't think this is a quirk. Quirks don't work like this, from everything I've ever read. Quirks are one thing, usually, fire, or strength, or shrinking, or whatever. This felt like a door opening onto everything at once, and I don't think a quirk is supposed to feel like that. I don't know what else it could be though. I don't have a word for not a quirk but also not nothing. I'm going to be more careful. Whatever this is, I don't think it's safe for other people to see it. I don't know why I think that. I just do. He closed the notebook. He locked it. And for the first time since he'd started keeping the second, secret half of it, he found himself doing something he hadn't done before, actively, deliberately practicing how to hide. The next several weeks became, in retrospect, a kind of unofficial curriculum, one Izuku designed for himself, alone, with no teacher and no textbook and absolutely no idea whether he was approaching any of it correctly, because there was no precedent for what he was trying to do. He was, in effect, trying to learn to control a language no one had ever taught him existed, using only the accumulated, hard-won observations of a single, isolated 11-year-old boy with a locked notebook and a private mirror. He learned, through trial and a great deal of error, that the eyes, he'd started, privately, calling them the ring eyes, a name that felt inadequate but was better than nothing, seemed to respond most readily to genuine need rather than deliberate summoning. The 3 times they'd surfaced fully so far had all come during moments of real pressure. Fear of Katsuki's spark, fear of the falling figure, and the overwhelming effort of the manga volume experiment. Calm, controlled attempts, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor deliberately trying to make them appear, mostly failed, or produced only the faintest, flickering trace of the pattern before it faded again. He learned that the pulling sensation, which he would eventually, much later, understand to be the barest, most fumbling edge of a technique with an actual name, a technique that belonged to an entire discipline he had no idea existed, worked best on light, close objects, and grew exponentially harder to control the farther away or heavier the target became. He gave himself, on one particularly reckless Sunday afternoon while his mother was out, a genuine, splitting headache trying to move his own desk chair from across the room, and spent the rest of the day lying very still with a cold washcloth over his eyes, telling his worried mother when she got home that he'd simply overdone it studying for a test. He learned, most importantly and most painfully, that the sharpest, most reliable way to make the pulling sensation surface at all was not calm concentration but genuine threat, and the primary, most consistent source of genuine threat in his 11-year-old life had a name, and that name was Katsuki Bakugo. It happened again, more dramatically this time, in late January, on the walk home from school. Katsuki had cornered him, not in the violent, deliberate way that would come to define their relationship a few years later, but in the smaller, meaner way that was, in its own fashion, worse for how casual it had become. A shove against the wall, a fistful of Izuku's collar, a string of the same accusations that had become a kind of ritual between them by then. "You've been avoiding me," Katsuki said, and there was something almost petulant beneath the aggression, something that a more perceptive adult might have recognized as the wounded confusion of a boy who didn't understand why his oldest friend had become both less than him, and somehow, impossibly, more than him at the exact same time. "Every time gym class rolls around you're weird about it now. You used to just be quirkless and pathetic. Now you're quirkless and weird, and I don't like weird, Deku. Weird means you're hiding something." "I'm not hiding anything," Izuku said, which was, of course, an enormous lie, and one of the very few outright lies he had ever told Katsuki Bakugo in his life. "Bullshit." Katsuki's grip tightened on his collar, and his other hand came up, palm open, a thin curl of smoke already rising from it. Not a real attack, not yet, more the beginning of one. The kind of escalating threat display that had become, over the past year, a language all its own between them. "Show me. Whatever you did in dodgeball. Whatever you did that day with the spark. Do it now." "I can't just. It doesn't work like that, Kakin. I don't control it. I don't even know what it." "Do it." And this time the spark wasn't a display. It was real, small but real, crackling toward Izuku's face with genuine heat behind it, the closest Katsuki had ever come, in all their years of friendship, curdling into something else, to actually, deliberately hurting him. What happened next took less than a second, and Izuku would spend years afterward trying, and failing, to fully reconstruct the sequence of it. The pressure came first, sudden, sharp, unmistakable, the same pulling sensation from his bedroom experiments, but stronger now, sharper, honed by weeks of unwitting practice into something closer to instinct than effort. His vision seemed to split, for a fraction of a second, into two overlapping layers. The ordinary world, Katsuki's furious face inches from his own, the gray winter sky behind him. And, laid over it like a diagram sketched in light, a precise, mathematical awareness of the spark's exact trajectory, its heat, its speed, the precise 6 inches of empty air it needed to cross to reach his skin. His hand moved. Not away from the spark, toward it, which surprised him more than it surprised Katsuki, an instinct he hadn't chosen and didn't understand. His palm angling to intercept the spark's path an inch before it would have reached his cheek, and the spark simply stopped. It didn't hit his hand. It didn't fizzle out the way the earlier sparks had fizzled against concrete or open air. It hung, suspended, for one impossible half-second in the space just above Izuku's palm, as though it had struck some invisible surface and simply had nowhere left to go, before winking out entirely, extinguished, with no smoke, no scorch mark, no sign it had ever existed at all beyond the lingering, acrid smell of ozone in the cold January air. Katsuki's hand had gone very still. His face, furious, sharp, wound tight with a year of accumulated confusion and resentment, had gone, for one unguarded moment, completely blank with shock. "What?" Katsuki said, very quietly, in a voice Izuku had never heard him use before, stripped entirely of its usual bravado. "The hell was that?" Izuku didn't answer. Izuku couldn't answer, because he was staring at his own outstretched palm with an expression of pure, wide-eyed astonishment that matched Katsuki's almost exactly, and because somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the astonishment and the fear and the dawning, vertiginous sense that he had just crossed some threshold he could never cross back over, a single word had surfaced, unbidden, with total and absolute certainty, though he had no idea where it had come from or what it meant: repel. He didn't say it out loud. He wouldn't have known what to do with it if he had, but it sat in his mind afterward, in the days and weeks that followed, like a single word of a foreign language dropped into an otherwise empty dictionary, a fragment of a vocabulary he did not yet possess, surfacing from some deep, dormant place inside him that was, ever so slowly, ever so patiently, beginning to wake up. Katsuki let go of his collar. He took a full step backward, putting distance between them for the first time in the entire encounter, and there was something in his face now that Izuku would think about for a long time afterward. Not fear, exactly, Katsuki Bakugo was constitutionally incapable of straightforward fear, but something adjacent to it, something wary and destabilized, the expression of a boy whose entire understanding of where he stood in the world relative to his oldest friend had just been quietly, irrevocably rearranged. "You're not quirkless," Katsuki said. It wasn't an accusation this time. It was closer to a demand for the world to make sense again. "I am," Izuku said, and his voice was shaking. "The doctor said, the X-ray said, I don't have the joint, Kaken. I really am quirkless. I don't know what that was. I don't understand it either, I swear." "Then what the hell do you call that?" Katsuki's voice cracked upward, some of the old fury returning now that the shock was fading, layering over the wariness in a way that made him seem, for a moment, almost as young and lost as Izuku felt. "Normal people don't stop sparks with their hand, Deku. Normal quirkless losers don't dodge 6 dodgeballs in a row and stop attacks out of midair." "You're lying to me. You've been lying to me this whole time." "I'm not." And Izuku, despite everything, despite months of careful, deliberate secrecy, despite the locked notebook and the rehearsed excuses and the private conviction that this was something too dangerous to say out loud to anyone, found himself, in that moment, telling the truth, all of it, in a single desperate rush, because the alternative was watching his oldest friend's face harden permanently into something that believed he was a liar. "I don't know what it is. I started noticing weird stuff maybe a year ago, catching things without meaning to, dodging without trying. And then a few weeks ago my eyes did something, there were rings in them, and I could feel, I don't know how to explain it, Kaken, I could feel the distance between things, like it was something I could touch, and just now I felt the spark coming and something in me just moved, without me deciding to move it, and I don't know what it is, I really, truly don't, and I've been scared to tell anyone because I don't know if it's dangerous or if I'm dangerous or..." He ran out of breath. He stood there, gasping slightly, in the middle of the sidewalk, having said more true words in the past 30 seconds than he'd said to another living person in the past 6 months combined. Katsuki stared at him for a long moment. The winter wind picked up, scattering a few dead leaves across the pavement between them, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary street felt, to Izuku, entirely disconnected from the enormity of what had just happened. Rings, Katsuki said finally slowly, like he was testing the word for weight. In your eyes. Yeah. Show me. I can't just make it happen, I told you it only. Try. Izuku hesitated. But there was something in Katsuki's voice now, not the old contempt, not quite curiosity either, something more complicated, something that Izuku, even at 11, recognized as the closest thing to genuine, unguarded attention Katsuki had given him in over a year, and some small, aching, hopeful part of him wanted, very badly, to hold on to it a moment longer. He closed his eyes. He thought about the spark, about the pulling sensation, about the way the world had briefly split into two overlapping layers of ordinary sight and something else, something vast and precise and terrifying, and he reached, carefully, deliberately, the way he practiced alone in his room, for that same pressure behind his eyes. It came faintly. He felt it more than saw it, a brief, cool flush across his vision, gone almost as soon as it arrived, and when he opened his eyes, Katsuki's face had shifted into something Izuku had genuinely never seen there before, not once in 7 years of friendship. Whoa, Katsuki said, very quietly, all the aggression gone out of his voice entirely. Your eyes are doing it. Right now. There's rings in there, Deku, there actually. Whoa. For one brief, fragile moment, standing on a cold sidewalk in the fading afternoon light, they were just two boys again, the way they'd been years earlier, before quirks and diagnoses and hospital elevators had carved a widening gap between them. Katsuki leaning in with wide, unguarded eyes, Izuku standing very still and letting himself be looked at, actually looked at, for the first time in longer than he could remember. It didn't last. Of course it didn't last. Katsuki Bakugo's wonder, even at 11 years old, curdled fast into something less generous. The same old fear dressed in new clothes. The fear that had driven his cruelty for the past year now finding an entirely new and more unsettling target. This isn't fair, Katsuki said, and his voice had gone hard again, the softness of a moment ago slamming shut like a door. I worked for my quirk. I trained. I earned it. And you just get to have some creepy eye thing that stops attacks and dodges dodgeballs, for free, and you don't even know what it is or where it came from. That's not fair, Deku. That's bullshit. I didn't ask for it, Izuku said, and something in him, some small ember of the frustration he'd been swallowing for over a year, finally caught. I didn't ask to be quirkless either, Kaken. None of this is something I chose. I didn't choose the diagnosis and I didn't choose whatever this is. I'm just as confused as you are. I'm scared of it. Yeah, well. Katsuki's palms were sparking again, small and controlled but unmistakably a warning. Figure it out somewhere I don't have to watch. Whatever that thing is, it's not normal, and I don't want it near me. He turned and walked away without looking back, and Izuku stood alone on the sidewalk for a long time afterward, the cold January wind cutting through his jacket, watching his oldest friends retreating back grow smaller and smaller until it turned a corner and disappeared entirely. He didn't cry this time. He was, in a strange and lonely way, past the point of crying about Katsuki specifically. What he felt instead, standing there alone, was something colder and more clarifying, the understanding, settling into him with the same finality as the doctor's diagnosis over a year earlier, that whatever was growing inside him had just cost him the last fragile thread connecting him to the boy he used to call his best friend, and that there was no getting it back now, not ever. No matter how hard he tried to explain it or hide it or make himself smaller to compensate for it. Ring eyes, he thought, walking home alone in the gathering dark, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Rings. Repel. A pulling that isn't pulling with your hands. He still didn't have real words for any of it. But that night, Notebook 17 received an entry longer and more honest than anything that had come before it, and at the very bottom of the page, after pages of careful, clinical observation, he wrote a single line that surprised him with how true it felt the moment the pen touched paper. I think whatever this is, it's not going away. I think it's just getting started. I don't know if that's supposed to feel like hope or like a warning. Maybe both. The doctor's office called 2 weeks later. It was not, on the surface, an alarming call, a routine follow-up. The receptionist explained to Inko over the phone, standard practice for children flagged during their initial quirklessness screening. Nothing to worry about, just a quick checkup to make sure everything was developing as expected. Izuku sat in the same paper gown, in the same examination room, 6 months older than the last time, and did his level best to seem like an entirely ordinary boy with an entirely ordinary body. It did not entirely work. Dr. Tsubasa ran through the usual checks first: height, weight, reflexes, the familiar tap of a small rubber hammer against his knee, and made the usual small, approving noises a doctor makes when nothing appears out of the ordinary. But when he got to the bloodwork panel, pulled up on a monitor angled just slightly out of Izuku's direct line of sight, his kind, easy expression faltered, just for a moment, into something more careful. Dr. Tsubasa said, and then, catching himself, added quickly, in the overbright voice adults use when they don't want a child to notice their concern, nothing to worry about. Just some readings I want to double-check, that's all. What kind of readings? Inko asked, and there was an edge in her voice now, the sharp, protective edge that only ever surfaced when something threatened her son. It's likely nothing, Dr. Tsubasa said, which was, Izuku had learned over the past year and a half, the exact phrase adults use right before they said something that was, in fact, not nothing at all. There are some irregularities in his baseline metabolic markers, and in a few readings from the ocular exam. Probably artifacts of the equipment, or just natural variation, but I'd like to flag it for a specialist to review, just to be thorough. Irregularities, Inko repeated slowly. What kind of irregularities? Dr. Tsubasa hesitated, glancing at the monitor again, at whatever unusual data had caught his attention, and then back at Izuku, a longer look this time, more searching, the kind of look Izuku had started to dread over the past several months, the look of an adult trying to see past an ordinary face to whatever might be hiding underneath it. Izuku, he said gently, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Anything about your body, your eyes, your reflexes, anything at all, that's felt different? Izuku's heart was pounding. He kept his face as still as he could manage, drawing on months of practice hiding exactly this kind of thing from his classmates, from Katsuki, from his own mother. No, he said. Nothing. Dr. Tsubasa held his gaze for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable, and Izuku had the distinct, unsettling impression that the doctor didn't quite believe him, not out of any specific evidence. Just the accumulated instinct of a man who had spent decades reading nervous children's faces for the things they didn't want to say out loud. All right, Dr. Tsubasa said finally, making a small note on his tablet. We'll just flag it for review then. Probably nothing, like I said. I'll have the specialist's office reach out if there's anything worth discussing. The appointment ended not long after, with the usual reassurances and the usual paperwork, and Izuku and his mother walked out of the office into a cold, overcast afternoon. And Inko didn't say much on the walk to the train station, her brow furrowed in a way that made Izuku's stomach twist with guilt he couldn't fully name. Irregularities, she said finally, mostly to herself, as they waited on the platform. I wonder what that means. Probably nothing, like he said, Izuku said, and hated how easily the small lie came out now, how much practice he'd had. He did not know, could not have known, sitting on that cold platform bench beside his mother, watching his breath fog in the winter air, that the flagged readings from that appointment would travel further than either of them could imagine, quietly filed, cross-referenced, and eventually, months later, would land on a desk far above Dr. Tsubasa's modest clinic, in an office belonging to an organization whose interest in anomalous children ran considerably deeper and considerably stranger than routine, pediatric follow-up. A small, private note, appended to an otherwise unremarkable medical file. Subject exhibits irregular baseline metabolic and ocular markers inconsistent with standard quirkless profile. Recommend flagging for continued observation. It would be a very long time before Izuku learned that note existed at all. But it had been written, and once written, like everything else that had begun to unfold in the quiet, ordinary rooms of his childhood that year, it could not be unwritten. That night, for the first time since he'd started the practice, Izuku did not write in Notebook 17 at all. He sat at his desk for a long time with the notebook open in front of him, pen in hand, and found that he simply had nothing left to say, or rather, that everything he might have written felt, for the first time, too large and too frightening to fit into the small, careful sentences he'd been using to contain it. Instead, he walked to the mirror on the back of his closet door, the way he had that first night in December, and looked at his own reflection for a long time. His eyes were green. Ordinary. Unremarkable, the way they'd always looked, the way they'd looked in every school photo and every mirror check for 11 years. He waited, watching, half hoping and half dreading that the rings would surface again, that he'd catch some glimpse of the pattern that had so unsettled Katsuki on that cold sidewalk 2 weeks earlier. They didn't come. Whatever governed their appearance, need, fear, the specific pressure of genuine threat, wasn't present in a quiet bedroom on an ordinary Tuesday night, and his reflection stayed stubbornly, disappointingly ordinary. What are you? He whispered to his own reflection, the same question he'd asked himself back in December, no closer now to an answer than he'd been then. What am I supposed to do with you? The mirror, of course, didn't answer. But somewhere deep beneath his ribs, in the place where something ancient and coiled had first stirred months earlier over a falling plastic figure, something shifted faintly in its sleep, not waking, not yet, but present, and patient, and listening in whatever strange, wordless way a thing like that listens, to a boy standing alone in front of a mirror, asking a question that would not find its real answer for years to come. Izuku turned off the light. He climbed into bed. And as he drifted towards sleep, he found himself thinking, not for the first time and far from the last, of All Might, of gold and blue against a burning sky, of a laugh that promised the world nothing bad could ever truly reach it while he was watching. I still want to be a hero, he thought, on the edge of sleep, with a stubbornness that had survived a diagnosis, survived a friendship curdling into something else, survived every strange and frightening thing that had happened to him over the past year and a half. Whatever this is, whatever I am, I still want that. He did not know, drifting off into a dreamless sleep, how much further that stubborn, ordinary wish would eventually carry him, or how strange and vast the path toward it was about to become. He only knew, with the same simple certainty he'd carried since he was 4 years old watching a hero pull 3 strangers from a burning building, that he wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. Not ever, if he could help it.